I think 2023 is a really interesting year. You've got so many variables that are changing the game, and they change them in a very fluid way. And so obviously, the recurring theme here is the macroeconomic conditions and the uncertainty that the industry faces.
Yeah.
You've got addressability in the future of the cookie. You've got some of the challenges that exist today in mobile with the introduction of ATT. And buying practices are changing because the ability to find that strength of signal isn't consistent across the board and is largely dependent on what type of channel that marketer is looking to invest their dollars into.
Right.
And so when you look to level the playing field, context becomes the most obvious choice. It's privacy friendly in most instances. I think in a world where privacy is only becoming more restrictive and not creating greater opportunity, it becomes a safer bet. But it also applies across channel, where today you've got patchwork privacy. What you've got in web and what you've got in mobile are vastly different than your ability to target CTV. And so, when you think about context, it becomes the universal currency by which agencies and marketers can start to plan, can start to target, and ultimately can start to find more effective outcomes in the media that they're investing in.
We know that the media industry and publishers at large, they generate a lot of demand for products, but for a long time they wouldn't get the credit for that. They would go to search. Now the same thing seems to be happening with retail media. Is there a better way that we can use signals to give publishers more credit for the demand they generate?
I think retail media is really, really interesting. I think another hot subject here at ALM. Over the past 2 years, you've seen a proliferation and just a huge number of companies who popped into the space. And I think the joke is everything's an ad network. And when you've got the ability to create bespoke marketplaces and to start understanding how you layer data onto the media that ultimately reaches the consumer, retail media becomes an area where I think you can start to buy in smarter, more effective ways, but also look at the closed loop results of that investment that you're ultimately putting forward and ultimately putting in front of your buy teams and in front of your clients.
You mentioned CTV. Is the dynamic going to play out differently between media and ad tech, given the lessons learned over the last decade?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a paradigm shift happening in CTV where the control goes back to the publisher. And so I think when you look at really different classes of publishers and how they're going to transact in CTV, I think it's very obvious you'll have a class that'll include walled gardens. You'll probably have some hedge gardens where the walled gardens will have sales teams that walk into the holding company. They do deals directly with the marketer, and they're going to have defined rate cards, and they'll sell the vast majority of that inventory themselves. You'll have walled gardens. Those walled gardens will have a hybrid approach where they'll sell as much as they can directly, and they'll look at third parties, SSPs, or partners who can help them to extract maximum value from the inventory they've got or the data assets they've got by collectively leveraging and taking the brand equity of those publishers and bringing them to a marketer to find scale and to find ultimate delivery. And then you'll have something that looks like the legacy open marketplace. And so ultimately that decision is up to the publisher to decide what the rules of engagement will be. I think the playbook hasn't been written and it's still early days, so time will tell.
You mentioned the walled gardens. We're seeing them somewhat break up in the open web marketplace, the display marketplace. Are we going to see a similar system emerge in CTV, or do you think it's going to be more of a democratic one?
CTV is it's high value inventory, and so when you look at a CPM in CTV, it's farly the number is like there's sticker shock for the average buyer, and so the average buyer who's looked at display inventory has thought about it as being pennies on the dollar, where CTV is dollars. Mm-hmm. And so I think what you'll find an environment that more closely resembles broadcast and looks a little bit less like the digital economy that you've seen over the past 10 years, which has been how cheaply can I buy it, but more so what am I getting for the dollars that I'm investing in that in that media specifically. And so as the practice of CTV becomes more refined, as measurement becomes more commonplace, more universal, and ultimately, those currencies start to shake out in terms of who the winners and losers are, I think you'll start to see more accountability, but you'll also see buyers start to recognize that the CPM sticker shock that probably existed a year or two ago as CTV became more common practice because of the shifts in consumer behavior. That's not there the way it was, and it will start to become the norm, not the exception.
Getting back to the open web and the broader ad tech ecosystem, do you think this is a year of a lot of uncertainty, as you mentioned? Do you think we're going to see a lot of change in the ad tech landscape going forward?
I hope we'll see a lot of change. I think that this is an industry that has been incredibly complicated, and I think as I go through my meeting schedule here over the next couple of days, one of my call to actions would be, how do we simplify things, right? Instead of dressing up the conversations that we have with really fancy language and lots of acronyms, how do we start to break things down to worlds where you've got a buyer, you've got a seller, you've got some intermediaries in between, but ultimately, how do we find efficiency in the conversations that we're having, but also simplicity in the way that we're describing the way that we get from the buyer to the seller to ultimately the consumer.
Lastly, what other things are you looking for this week at IAB?
I think there are a couple of key themes here. Obviously, the state of the economy and the state of the industry it's part of every discussion. No one's got a crystal ball, and yet I think people remain relatively optimistic. There's definitely a recurrent theme around addressability and what the future looks like. There are just any number of universal identifiers out there. Index remains neutral in terms of supporting them all until there's a defined winner. And so, I think the question is, who's winning, or how do we help the market get to a place where there's forced urgency, rather than it being a right problem, how do we make it a right now conversation? And so how do we take some of those discussions around identifiers, which now I think we've been having, and they've been commonplace for 2 to 3 years, and how do we make them common practice as part of our day-to-day? Lastly, I think privacy, right? Privacy is important. Privacy is important to all of us because we're all consumers, and so there's level of sensitivity and concern amongst every single individual participant here. What does that mean to us personally? What does it mean to our businesses? And what does it mean to the industry as regulators start to get more involved, and as there's this big cloud of uncertainty in a world which is only becoming more complicated to operate in? And so how do we, again, understand what that means, but also simplify how we create the ability for our partners to transact to ultimately find the business outcomes that they desire?